Good to see you all here. My name is Steve Dee. I'm here to talk about motorgliding in the USA. This was probably prompted this effort to get involved with motorgliding from my Air Force tour many years ago when I owned a Diamant and could fly it about 6 times a year for the lack of getting to the neighborhood of a tow plane. Ever since then, I've been very passionate about self-launching. So that's what I'm here to talk about today. For those of you who don't know me, I like to bring a self-portrait. So, yeah. This is how the pilot views himself. Very humble. So just a little bit about my background. I was fortunate enough to learn to fly from scratch in gliders and solo when I was 14. Spent 30 years between the active Air Force and the Air Guard flying mostly tactical jets. And this marks my 50th year as a CFIG. My 25th renewal is about to take place, so 50 years. I had a great commercial career as a freighter dog, flying for FedEx. Currently work as a DPE in the Memphis FSDO for gliders and airplanes. I am continually trying to maintain my activity within the SSA community by being a trustee for the Soaring Safety Foundation. So first, some acknowledgements of sources of information, data, and great memories. I learned to fly in the Adrian Soaring Club back in the 60s and was mentored by some of the greats that flew there. Perhaps you recognize the name of national champions A.J. Smith, Brian Schreeder, heavily influenced by other members of the club who were nationally active. Later, when I moved to Colorado Springs to attend the School for Wayward Boys, joined the Colorado Soaring Association, flew with them while I was there, and later got hooked up with the Ox-powered Sailplane Association, those crazy guys that fly motorgliders. And in that group, there's some distinguished names there, people who provided lots of great inspiration and mentorship. Here's what we'll talk about today. A little bit on statistics, some regulatory issues, focus on training, just a brief walk through history of motorgliders, the concept of how we use them, and hopefully at the end we have some time for some Mythbusters and FAQs. If you look at the aircraft registry today, there are over 10,000 gliders registered, and over 10% of them have motors of some kind. Well, one thing people ask is, well, what about safety? And if you take a 20-year look back, 747 accidents over the last 20 years or so. The average unpowered glide accident rate in total, 12.3%. Same thing for gliders, 8.3%. What does that prove? Well, nothing, except that perhaps they're certainly not more dangerous than their unpowered brethren. Who flies them? Mostly individuals and partnerships. There are a couple of clubs throughout the country that are using powered gliders, and a very few commercial operators, of which I used to be one. And others, like in the past, the United States Air Force Academy used them in their program to accelerate the pace of initial training to get student pilots to solo earlier and faster in the aerotow environment. And the CAP, in like manner. I have attended about 10 of these soaring academies and offer the use of my motor glider to greatly accelerate the path to solo. Who makes them? Well, if you go out on the floor here, there's some great examples. And the changing landscape is that the vast majority of gliders coming out the door of all the major manufacturers are motorized in some way. So here are the numbers. I try to interview reps each convention and ask them, so how many of these craft have motors affixed? And you see the numbers here, a lot. People are figuring out why you should fly a motor glider. So first and foremost for me was independent launch. Back in the 80s, I had this beautiful Diamant 18 stationed in West Texas, and the only tow plane was 150 miles away in Uvalde. That was before Uvalde was a going thing and a well-known site. And so I didn't get to fly often. And I dreamed of the day after attending a convention in Atlanta and saw a DG 400 on the floor with the retractable engine, steerable tailwheel. I go, that is what I must own one day. Well, later, many years later, it came to pass. And not just avoiding the wait in line for the tow, but the ability to go to independent sites. No need for the tow plane, tow line, assistant, all the falderall that it takes to aero tow a glider into the air. It's a great thing. We'll go on safari. This year, I'll be going to several different sites with a bunch of powered motorheads, and we're just gonna take advantage of local environments where there's no tow plane and no club and great soaring. And self-launching allows you to do that. In flight, end of the day, run out of lift. If nothing else, it will allow you to use an in-flight start and get to an airport versus an off-runway landing. And in my case, no crew, no problem, self-retrieve. I referred to the training efficiency that they provide. In the case of aero tow operations, a well-run, well-staffed operation might be able to launch 3, maybe 4, I'm not talking contest conditions, normal club flying, maybe 4 flights an hour. But in self-launching, I could probably do 10 short training flights in the same amount of time without any other personnel involved. So there's a tremendous training efficiency. Got to talk regulations, and under regulatory issues, we have regs, orders, advisory circulars that affect both the certification and qualification of the craft and the airman. So let's take a look. Regulations, if you think way back to the roaring 20s, barnstorming took the country by storm. There were lots of accidents, and they were usually tragic accidents. So the original CAA, born in the late 20s, which evolved later to the CAB and finally the FAA, was tasked by the government to do these things. First, we need to promote and regulate all air commerce. We're going to create minimum safety standards, and we're going to make these regulations directive. If you're going to fly, you're going to have to be certificated, regulated, and follow these directions. Compulsory for all users. Now, we also have orders. FAA orders are written primarily for their internal use. FAA surveillance of policy and procedures. And just like everything to do with the FAA, they come in 3 broad pillars of authority, and those are ops, maintenance, and avionics. We're mostly familiar with the operational side. These are directive, but really just for internal FAA use and those affiliated, such I'm a DPE, so I have a set of FAA orders that I must comply with in performing my role as a DPE. Likewise for a DAR or a parachute rigger or any other designated FAA position. Finally, we got advisory circulars. There's an office in Washington that takes questions. Pilots in the field call up and say, I don't understand 6156. What are you trying to say? And that office, when they receive enough of these queries, they say, we better clarify that. So they write an advisory circular to try and address the issues raised. Sometimes it makes it worse. But they are an attempt to make an explanation for the regulations we don't understand. But remember, they're just that. They're recommendations, therefore they're permissive in nature. Motor glider certification, this is interesting. If you go to FAR Part 1 definitions and look for the word motor glider, you will not find it. Nor will you find the term powered glider. It doesn't exist. So they wrote an AC, this particular one, 2117-2A, to describe what constitutes a, quote, powered glider. That's the official FAA term for what we fly. Since we're mostly accustomed with the term motor gliders, I'll just continue to use that. But there's 3 criteria: max of 2 seats, a gross weight of 850 kilograms, which is about 1874 in pounds, and a span loading limit. This latter criteria is to preclude a very lightly loaded airplane from masquerading as a powered glider. Some of the touring motor gliders flirt with this limitation. And in fact, there are some, such as those made by Pipistrel, that can be certificated in your choice, either as an airplane or as a glider. Finally, FAR 91205 describes engine instruments required, and that's really relating to any power plant requires oil pressure, etc., fuel quantity, whatever's appropriate for that engine installation. So we got 3 motor glider types that we'll talk about, and those are self-launched sailplanes, or SLSs, touring motor gliders,, and then sustainers. Europeans call them turbos. First, self-launch sailplanes. Here's an example of a nice new Ventus 3M, V3M as it's sometimes called, and very typical of the self-launch sailplane configuration. It's a pure high-performance sailplane that's been fitted with a retractable power plant, in this case on a pylon behind the cockpit, with a steerable tail wheel to make powered taxi on the airport surface possible, and then either skids or small wheels at the wingtips so the wings don't drag while you're taxiing like a lame duck around the airport. Touring motor gliders. These are the true hybrid. They look like airplanes with long wings, if you will. So they reflect the high aspect ratio design that you see on the wings of a sailplane, but are typically fitted into a fuselage and cockpit that looks much more like an airplane. The power plants of these types are not usually a two-stroke engine that's intended to be run for only short periods, but rather engines like the Rotax and or Sig Sauer, Volkswagen derivative type engines that could be run all day under power. And in fact, many owners of this type of aircraft fly them that way. And as you can see in the picture on the right, they can have a lot of instrumentation. Finally, sustainers. European turbo. Here's a picture of a typical, this is a Ventus 2 BT, the T for turbo, and it's got a small power plant, but it's not a sufficient thrust to get airborne on its own. So it's towed aloft by some other means, and this can be extended in flight. Here's the big difference. This power plant does not have a starter. It must be windmill started by actuating a compression release and obtaining windmill RPM. They normally don't have a throttle. They just run at full throttle until you either shut it off or it runs out of fuel. Nominal climb rates, maybe 1 or 2 knots, are typically capable, and these provide perhaps as many as 50, 70, 100 kilometers cruising, depending on the fuel capacity in that particular machine. Kind of a new concept here is the electric FES, and there's several examples of these on the floor today if you want to take a look. They are a nose-mounted folding propeller that's really quite clever, powered by an electrical battery system. In my opinion, I'll just say that the technology is not quite mature. There are still battery issues, and I'm not sure I want to have the motor right in front of my feet. But this is one version of sustainer we're seeing today. And then becoming popular as well is the jet sustainer. These are available on a number of gliders, Yonkers and others. Here you see a JS1 with their small turbine. This is a turbine affixed, less than 100 pounds thrust, and again, can't really climb much, but it'll take you home until it's out of fuel. There are a couple other jet efforts in progress. Seated before you, none other than the famous Chris Esselton took a wrecked ASW-27 and fitted 2 little RC motors, jet turbocats, that give it enough thrust to self-launch. So far, it's a one and only. Bob Carlton, whom many of you are acquainted with, modified a TST bonus 2-seater with a PBS 250-pound thrust turbine that's retractable, and he calls it the bonus jet. That is currently just being used for training. In addition, he's taken 4 Arcus M's and fitted them with that same turbine. Let's just say that I don't think there's any more production planned. Pretty high cost, loud, and there's regulatory issues. So jets are here. Not sure they'll really replace the small internal combustion engine. So how do we become one of these motor glider pilots? First of all, got to have a glider category rating. Second, you need a self-launch endorsement. This is mandated by Part 51. Remember, directive, compulsory by all users, and it's described in accomplishment in advisory circular. Since the reg doesn't really tell you how to become one, this advisory circular was written 6194 to do just that. There is also a grandfather clause that most of us are too old to currently qualify for, but insurance requirements generally dictate if you're going to fly a self-launcher, you need to have a self-launch endorsement. So who can give the training? You need a glider category CFI who also has a self-launch endorsement. Makes pretty much sense. Also, the advisory circular recommends that if, Mr. CFI, you are training a trainee who does not have any powered experience, glider only, that you should at least hold a commercial single engine land so that you can share your knowledge of powered operations. That makes sense. All right, so here's where the rubber meets the road. 6131J1 III says, thou shalt not self-launch until you've been appropriately trained and found competent in self-launch operations. I've highlighted ground and flight training. I don't know how you do the flight training in anything but a self-launch sailplane or TMG that can self-launch. Here's the grandfather clause. Back in '97, there was a change. Prior to that time, if you were a glider pilot and you were qualified in aerotow, it actually said that on your pilot certificate. Private pilot, glider-aerotow. If you wanted to add another launch methodology, you had to take another check ride from an examiner and get that added to your certificate. Well, it was at this time in '97 they decided, no, we're going to reorganize our thinking. Now the rating is just that. The category rating appears on your certificate, and your launch methodology now appears in your logbook. It's either ground, including winch, truck tow, aero, or self-launch. One of those three must be in your logbook. The bottom of the slide, you see that the qualification for the self-launch being waived by the grandfather clause if you had logged time prior to January 1, 1985 in a self-launch sailplanes, you are considered to have met the requirements of the self-launch endorsement. Pretty much gone by. So let's talk about the AC. It starts out, like all of them, with a purpose statement to include the fact that this provides recommendations. This is not regulatory. It probably reflects industry best practice, a lot of good ideas, but it's not compulsory. It says right off the top, here's one way, not the only way, to train gliders safely into self-launch operations. Notice applicability, no difference between the various powered glider types. 2 syllabus I recommend. A, for the private pilot who has airplane experience and a glider rating, and it recommends very little. 3 takeoffs and landings and a flight check. I'm not sure what a flight check is per se in this text. FAA uses the terms training, checking, and testing, and none of those really apply to this, so I'm not sure what that means, but I'm guessing it's a signature by an instructor endorsing what he has seen. And then ground training. Syllabus B, a little more extensive because this is for the guy who has no airplane experience. It says 5 hours of dual, 2 hours of solo, dual cross country, and then ground training in all areas. So in the many years I conducted self-launch endorsement training in my school, I would take a combination of these 2 things and do what makes sense and train a guy until he's competent. In the early days, it seemed like I was asking people to come for 2 days to get all this done. And I found that most folks could get it done in 1 day, and so that's what we did. You know, the self-launching idea is not new. Barely 30 years into the life of aviation here in America, people were trying to figure out how to get rid of the tow plane. And so in '35, the Carton-Baines Auxiliary, this was a British effort, you know, its retractable engine looked a lot like systems we see today, but made differently by the available components of the day. Then along in the early '40s, the Hirth HI-20, here's the engine on a stick, retractable. I actually saw a copy of a Nelson Hummingbird flying in Toledo, Ohio, my home of many years. I thought, what the heck is that? And later recognized it looks an awful lot like a Schweitzer 232 with a retractable engine on a stick. There are one of these, I believe, in the Southwest Soaring Museum. There's only several copies made and around the country can be viewed. But this was quite a development for its day. Scheibe, a very long-known glider manufacturer in Germany, they reached their heyday really in the wood, steel tube fabric era, and their SF-27 was a hot 15-meter glider of the day. They said, well, let's motorize that thing. And it retracted back in the fuselage the same way. Schempp-Hirth Well, let's take that Nimbus that people love and put an engine in the back. And that was the 2M74. Pick 20E, an adaptation of the 20D, which was not an extremely popular glider to begin with. The 20E was kind of a failure as a self-launcher. It just didn't have that great a performance. And the only self-launcher I'm aware of that actually had a manually retracting engine pylon. So 14 cranks like this while you're flying the glider to put the engine down, compared to the systems we have today, not real popular. The DG400, this is actually a shot of mine from years gone by. This was extremely popular, adapted from the DG200 series. DG said, I know what glider we can engine, and that's this one. It was very popular, sold well, just under 300 copies produced, many of them still active in the US today. And then we get to the STEMI. It doesn't know what it is. It doesn't really fit the SLS or the TMG concept. It gets in the air on its own, certainly. It's got a fixed 4-stroke Rotax run-all-day engine mounted within the fuselage, an extendable nose cone with a retracting prop so that you can convert to glider mode. Big, heavy, expensive. Unfortunately, the empty weight is so high that you can't actually carry 2 adults legally under the useful load constraint of any STEMI. But they won't tell you that. Anyway, Herr Dr. Grob took the last 50 examples of the infamous 103, and by that time it was the Twin 3 Acro, were the last ones produced, all carbon fiber, and fitted them with an engine, retractable, behind the cockpit, 2-seater. It had a steerable, partially steerable nose wheel, so you could get it around the airport, and a 2-position prop, climb and cruise. I used this in my school for many years. It was a great trainer because I never had to simulate malfunctions. They just happened all the time. The standard post-flight walk-around included an inspection of the engine bay, and there was usually something in there that wasn't when I took off. All right, then along came Pipistrel with their side-by-side Taurus. When this first was produced, Slovenia did not have bilateral aviation rights with the US, and so it could be imported into the US, but only as experimental. That did me no good in my school. So I waited until they achieved that status, and when it did, I bought my first one and used them throughout several years in my school. Very successful as a companion trainer for your typical DG, ASH, JS1 type pylon-mounted conventional gear configured glider. Current production, here's just a few names. There are many great examples out on the floor. You can check these out today. Just a brief walk through TMG history. Scheibe also made touring motor gliders. And in fact, the SF-25 is the model most produced. Over 1,500 of these have been made over the years in various configurations. The steel tube, fabric, and wood wing all stayed the same. The only changes since 1963 have been the combination of landing gear between conventional, single wheel, or tricycle gear, and which engine and prop combination you wanted. This one actually had a 100 horse with a MTV constant speed prop and a factory supplied tow hook. I towed gliders with this, which is a fairly common practice in Europe. Towing gliders with a TMG, very advantageous economically, and it operates the same speed. They make very good tow plates. Here's another example. The Grob 109B cockpit looks like an airplane. It was a lousy glider. It was a marginal airplane, but it was a legitimate self-launch trainer, which is how I used it for a short time. And finally, Pipistrel in with the Sinus. The Sinus series, Virus and short wing models, the Alpha, they all share the same derivative wing from the Taurus, 15 meter, and reduced in various spans and different models, and tail, but fixed to a airplane-like fuselage to include the option for tricycle gear. Scheibe got in the act. 2011, they took their SF-25 and modernized it into a really nice composite TMG. Never seen one in the US, but there are a few of these in Europe. The Phoenix, probably the most glider-like, both in performance and handling. but with a fixed forward-mounted Rotax engine, feathering prop, and there are a number of these in the country today. So how do we make use of this thing? Engine utilization, obviously, we talked about initial launch. We can use it for an in-flight start to preclude retrieve or land out. If it's not working, it's great ballast. The initial launch, probably what most people use their engine for. Total independence, you choose the time and the place, my kind of thing. Independent taxi and launch. What could possibly go wrong? Well, the engine can fail on takeoff. That's probably the most significant thing. Unlike the rope break scenario in a towed glider, the engine failure on takeoff in a self-launcher is a little bit more serious. The reason being, you have a very high drag configuration. Your airspeed is flirting with your approach speed and or decelerating as you maintain flight with an engine that's extended and not running and creating lots of drag, and you need to take aggressive action. First thing, no matter what, lower the nose. When I train folks in this, we actually do simulated engine off scenarios, and they don't believe me when I say, you're not going to believe what kind of nose down it takes to keep flying airspeed until you actually do it. Very high drag. Once you've done that, you can assess your energy situation and make a determination. Do I need to just turn to avoid obstacles, or can I make a 180 and come back to the runway? You know, as an examiner, I hate to hear aerotow applicants call out, 200, I can turn back. Well, maybe, and maybe not. And depends on your energy state. Well, the same thing is true here. I have had a number of engine failures on takeoff in various circumstances, survived them all. No undesired aircraft states resulted, but it's because the first thing I did is put the nose down and maintain flying speed, and then figure out what you can do from there. So aside from the initial start and launch, we can use the engine in flight, but we need to be smart about it. We can use it for continuation between thermals. You got a 30-mile hole, but you're not ready to quit flying. Put out the engine, fly across the hole. Out of lift, at the end of the day, get to an airport, and finally self-retrieve. Either level cruise profile, which is mostly what the electrics do, since they're very incapable of climbing. But if you have a self-launcher, the most mileage you can get from your fuel is to fly what we call a sawtooth profile. Climb, cruise. Climb, cruise. And in my 31 MI, I typically count on, with 16 liters of fuel, I take off. You spend about 3 for launch, and I figure, okay, with the remaining fuel, I can easily make 75 to 100 miles with 3 or 4 powered climbs in completely dead air. That's my game plan. So what are some challenging in-flight starts? Well, that's really anything done from a low altitude. Whether it's a sustainer or a self-launcher, the sustainer makes it worse because you need to dive with the compression release open to windmill start your engine. It takes 300 to 400 feet to do that. So your decision matrix flying a sustainer is really more challenging than a self-launcher. Another challenge is flying the ridge, you fall off, what do? Well, you're typically maybe only 600, 800 feet above the valley floor. What equates to number 1? You've got very little time and or altitude to get the engine out and make it run. Not sure I do that. And finally, aero tow assist. This just waters my eyes, but I see it done, and I've yet to see a mishap, so I guess it's okay. But if you can imagine, a self-launcher with his engine running, hooked up to a tow plane with both engines running, and off they go. The potential for hazard seems great to me, but I see this happening when you have like an ASG 32, it's too heavy, full of water to launch from Pair 1. We got a weak tow plane, let's hook that up, and between the two of them, we'll get it airborne. Waters my eyes, but it happens. I'm not sure I do that either. All right, so what is the impact of losing that engine from the POHs of various gliders? A DG400, your 45 turns into 18 to 1. These are all worst case scenario, engine extended, not running, and windmilling. You have the drag equivalent of a disc the size of your propeller diameter. It's a drogue chute. Ben is 2 cm. This is in the book. I did not make this up. 50 to 1 goes to 13 to 1. And others are very similar. Drastic reduction. Time to glide. If our 18-meter ship can glide or have a min sink of around 100 feet per minute, from 2,000 feet, you've got about 17 minutes in calm air before you're in the pattern. Well, not so much. If you got that engine out and stuck, you got about 4 minutes to the ground at a rate of 600 to 800 feet per minute rate of descent to figure out what to do. Why is that a bad thing? We have shown over and over again that rushed decisions are generally bad decisions. So for that reason, decide up higher. In the Air Force, we use the term ORM for Operational Risk Management. Our in-flight start considerations need to take into account these factors. What altitude do I have? What am I over in terms of terrain? I consistently preach, don't even touch the first switch in the start of the process unless you're over something you can land on. Doesn't have to be an airport, just some recovery spot in case things don't go well, because there are times that they don't. Systems. We can look at our electrical load via some instrument, whether it's your LX or a radio. You can typically tell what's the state of your batteries. And you know typically what your fuel is, but the one that's hard to figure out is my engine cold soaked. Two-stroke engines do not like to start when they're cold, and I've experienced this. So these are things to consider before I put the engine out for an in-flight start. So my rule of thumb when I'm training folks in the beginning with your machine, don't even think about it below 1500 AGL. This is a nice beginning level hard deck. You can try several things that if you get the steps out of order between 1500 and where it starts to get critical. But much below that, you really ought to just be considered a glider. Let's put it on the ground. Unfortunately, there are several cases where that's not been true, and following a bad thought process of, I got to get the engine running, fly the glider into an obstacle, a bad field, whatever, and break the glider and hurt the pilot. So either 1500 or let's be established in the pattern in a position to land. And this is a common technique. Put yourself downwind, 800 to 1,000 feet, start the engine. If it starts, fly away. If it doesn't, land in the field you've already selected. So here is an example. It's kind of I'm sometimes reluctant to share this story because it shows poorly on me as a CFIG. I'm in the back seat with a trainee in the Mighty Grove SL. The guy came to me and said, I own a Pegasus, but I've never been off field, and I'd like to practice some simulated off-airport landings. I said, great. That's a perfect use of the powered glider. So off we went. We're north of Memphis. We're flying around, and I'm trying to coach him through field selection, and we do that. And then we're getting down about 1,500 AGL. I said, okay, we're going to go ahead and start the engine, and we're going to go ahead and fly an approach to the field you've selected, and we'll see how it works out. And then we'll go around. With one problem. Due to a switch error that I could not see from the back seat, we managed to get the pylon extended about 90% of the way, and then it locked up because of an inner safety switch, and the engine would not start. And after several repeated attempts, could not retract it. Remember, it was the Grove with many malfunctions. I don't think there was anything actually wrong with it. It just was switch error. And so I said, I guess we're landing in your field. Let's hope it works out. And we did, because we were committed to the fact that you get to the hard deck, now you're a glider. Just fly the airplane to a landing. Well, after several hours of intensive effort, we got the Grobosaurus apart into the trailer, and off we went home to talk about switchology, and for me to consider, let's not do that again that way. All right, well, so here's an off-field that didn't work out so well. I don't know the circumstances of this scenario. I used the picture to get your attention, and I hope I have. This is a UAS. That's an undesired aircraft state. How did this happen? Probably a self-launch, as it appears, because the engine's out, and the asphalt to the right looks like it's a taxiway. I see a yellow stripe in the middle. I'm guessing this was a self-launch that went bad and was unfortunately mismanaged to result in a ground loop. This is what we want to avoid. How do we do that? Training. So, a few Mythbusters, things that I hear repeatedly over time. Motorgliders are dangerous. Well, my earlier slide showed you just a gross percentage rate of incidents and reportable accidents. I don't think motorgliders are dangerous. They have risks and potential hazards that pure gliders don't, but we overcome that through risk mitigation and competent pilot training. So I don't think they're dangerous. Second, motorgliders are hard to fly. I disagree. If you can pat your head and rub your tummy, you can probably master what I call the monkey motion of getting the engine in or out for self-launch and or in-flight start and or in-flight shutdown and recovery. So I disagree with this. What I will say is they require a higher level of training and more practice proficiency, mostly with regard to the monkey motion. Every type is got its own steps. Some are more complicated than others. In the case of the TMGs, to shut down, you turn the switch, throw the lever for the prop, and you're a glider. In others, like the STEMI, there's up to 9 steps to do to configure things for shutdown, etc. And most modern SLSs are somewhere in between. The DG400 was pretty much a manual system where you had a manual handbrake to pull and manually watch the prop as it swung to get it in the right place in the mirror. Right there, hold it. And hold it there while you retracted it. On to more sophisticated examples like the DG800. Shut it off, it's automatic. Prop center, boop, down it goes. And things in between. So I disagree. I don't think motor gliders are hard to fly. Motor gliders are expensive. This is not a myth. And the first time this became evident to me, I still maintain a DG400 on the market today, best bang for the buck in an SLS. I bought mine for $50,000 20 some years ago and sold it a number of years later for $65,000. It retains its value still today. Not the case with most newer ships. If you talk to any of the reps on the floor today, the cost of getting just about anything into the US is going to be $300,000 and up, just depending on which flavor you're talking about. And so, yes, they are expensive. Is it worth it? Well, only you can decide that. In my case, in the middle 25 years of my glider flying career, where I was very much devoted to flying tactical jets and freighters, I was physically remote from any soaring operation. I could not get launched. And so for me, the only way to get launched was self-launching. So it was worth a lot to me. And then I discovered, hey, you can get together a couple of buddies and go on safari. And that is really fun, to different places. So is it worth it? It's your personal assessment. It's not just avoiding the wait for the tow at your club location. All right, some frequently asked questions. This is really to see if you've been paying attention. Can I legally fly a motor glider with just an airplane's single engine land rating? No. Good. Well, what if I promise to keep the engine running? No. All right, do I need a medical to fly a motor glider? No, it's a glider. In fact, I soloed from ab initio what I think was the youngest, I'm pretty sure it was the youngest student pilot at age 16, learned to fly from scratch in my Grobe 103. And people look at me and said, "You're going to let some teenager fly your glider?" I go, "You betcha." You train them from day one in gliders and they know how to fly. All right, do I need a self-launch endorsement for my sustainer? I see a couple of yeses, but no. Unless it can actually self-launch. There are just a couple of gliders that are sold as, quote, turbos. I can think of one example, the DG1000T. It has the same extension system, starter, and retraction system as the bigger engined 1000M, but it's only intended, because it's 26 horsepower, for sustaining. However, flown solo on a long runway, I'd be willing to bet you could get that thing in the air. If you do, then you'd best have a self-launch endorsement. The endorsement, remember the regulation? It's not written for the brand description of the aircraft. It's written for the act of self-launching. Do I need an endorsement to fly my experimental self-launcher? Absolutely. Apples and oranges. Has nothing to do with it. This exemption that's cited in 6131K III applies to completely unrelated events. This is thrown in my face. It says right here, I don't need it. I go, no, you're reading that wrong. If you're going to self-launch, you need the endorsement. How about, I'm just going to fly solo. I'm not carrying any passengers. Do I still need that endorsement? Obviously, yes, complete and a signature in your logbook. How low can you safely make a 180 return and get back to the runway? It's my favorite answer. It depends. What's the climb capability of that aircraft? What were the winds that day? How long is the runway? Where did the engine failure occur? All of these things factor into whether or not I can make a safe return. I have actually made returns from about 200 feet, but I really think it's only because it was in the middle of summer and I was very actively engaged in training and doing this as practice a lot. And so when my Grobe 103's 505 punched itself out the side of the crankcase and the prop just went, pop, I did not take long to have to react and perform the 180. Having assessed the energy, I thought, we can make it back, and we did. But the number I like to throw out is at least 500 HEL for most occasions, and maybe higher, just depending on these four factors. Can I use my Grobe 109B or Shimano tail dragger to update my single engine land tailwheel currency? I see some nods. They're all tail draggers. There's the key. Nice try, but no. 6157A1 double I specifically uses the word airplane versus aircraft when it talks about landing currency. And so even though it's the identical skill and perfect proficiency obtained by flying a TMG tail dragger, no, you cannot use it to update your airplane landing currency. Do I need the endorsement to fly my Monterey, which has long wings and short wings, or my Europa, long wings and short wings, or a Pipistrel Sinus Flex, which has removable tips to make it long wing and or short wing? Correct on the front row. It all depends on the certification. In all cases, the key is the certificate of airworthiness and the pilot's certificate must match in terms of category. So if you're flying a Europa that was certificated as an airplane and the owner puts the long wings on it, if he's certificated as an airplane, he doesn't need a self-launch endorsement. But if he goes to the other route and makes it a glider, takes off the long wings and flies short, he'd best have a self-launch endorsement and a glider rating to fly it because it's a glider. So paperwork must match. Can I take my endorsement training in a TMG, like a Grobe, and then legally fly an SLS? They seem very different. Yeah, remember the AC talked about no differentiation between the three types. Training for one is legally sufficient for all. When I first started my little school 20-some years ago, I had a Grobe 109 and found that most of my clientele had a DG or an ASH, and although the training made them legal, it didn't really provide what they needed. So that's when I got rid of the 109, got the SL, and provided much more realistic training. So where do you get this training today? You go see Rex. He's the only person I can think of in the country that's operating a pylon-mounted retractable self-launcher 2-seat where you can get the training required by regulation. You can get legal by flying a TMG. It's just not the same. All right, well, I'm around through the end of the convention. Here is an email address if you'd like to forward questions. Have lots of opinions and glad to share them with whoever asks. So thank you very much.